I've seen this many times in corporate
Mhm.
consulting. They will be like, "Yep, it's my fault." And I'm like, "Dude, I was there. It's totally not your fault. What do you mean? Fire that jerk." Like he totally
Yeah,
went right against exactly what you said. Get rid of this guy because that's just the way I am, obviously. Um,
yeah,
I didn't say any of that out loud, but like I'm like, "What is going on?" And he'll just take the bullet.
yeah.
And right, and that's a
I think that's
sacrifice.
right. Yeah, that's like the baseball coach at the press conference at the end when it was clearly a mistake by the player taking taking the
Yeah,
hit or, resolving that in conflict in private, that conflict between the coach and the player in private, not calling that person out, not scapegoating that
right,
person. Like, the reason why we lost is because of that guy. No, it's me. That, I'm the one gonna take that. Yeah.
right.
I think you're right. That's sacrificing down. Yeah.
Right, and so
And
Girard
see.
right, right, in that the one can't stand for the many, but the one can take responsibility for the many,
Mhm.
and that restores hierarchy.
I think a proper sacrifice, if you now I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but what you'll notice is that when you sacrifice in the proper way, it always comes back. So when you sacrifice up,
Mhm.
it comes back to you. Peugeot's example of a sacrifice up would be, for example, paying taxes. So in a
Right,
proper system, you sacrifice up, and now you have a road to drive on. So
yes,
so the sacrifice actually comes back. That's in the sense of in the sacrificial system, the idea that you would sacrifice the animal, but then that becomes a meal, and so now you're eating the animal. So you did sacrifice it up, but or around the kitchen table, you're all coming together and you're doing a sacrifice up for the sake of the family unity of the family, and now it comes back. So that's maybe there is a distinction to be made there. Gerard is trying to um, critique the wrong way that sacrifices work.
alright. Welcome, everybody. I have a special treat today. Uh, Justin's Morning Coffee, Justin Wells, has agreed to discuss Girard and Peugeot, and this is mostly around Scapegoat. That's his big thing, and mimetic desire, which I actually think is probably his better work. Neither of us are experts, so keep that in mind. And we're going to do a lot of out loud exploration. And I'm so glad that Justin's making time for this because this is going to be an amazing conversation. And I did want to explore this, so it's good to have somebody who's also thought about it, deeply to explore it with. And much more importantly, the thing that people probably don't realize is that Justin is awesome. So Justin, why don't you introduce why and how you're awesome to us?
um, well, yeah. So I've been like you, been kicking around this little corner of the internet for a couple years now. I was sort of initiated in by Paul Vanderklay and John Van Donk, who lives here in LA, uh, and the Estuary Project, and we met up at the you and I met up at the Symbolic World Summit, and I've talked to people in Germany with in this little corner of the Netherlands. I was just there in the Netherlands a little while ago. I didn't make it to their festival, but I was there a couple months ago. And anyway, so we got to talking on you and I got to talking on Twitter. Um, and I work in the film business, and I really most of my work over on my channel, which is Justin's Morning Coffee, is on story structure and trying to understand what a narrative is, writing, and I just started looking into Rene Girard pretty much because Jonathan Peugeot mentioned Rene Girard, and his first book is about the novel. Rene Girard's first book is about the novel, and so I started thinking, you know what, I should look into this. I should, I mean, there's certain people. It's like Derrida. It's like, well, I should know what they say. I should know. A smart person should at least have interacted with these ideas. So I started to look into it, and then my friend Tim, who lives here, is a novelist, and he recommended this podcast, which goes through. So I read, when Satan falls like lightning, when I see Satan fall like lightning, which is his book, his 2002 or 2004 book. Um, and kind of just piecing it together. There's another person that's a Girard scholar who I kind of said, "Hey, will you jump on Zoom with me and kind of explain some of this to me because I'm trying to figure it out." And he was nice enough to kind of sit down with me for an hour and kind of explain what he thinks is going on. And then so you and I started talking over Twitter, and we decided, hey, let's process through a little bit of this. I think it is the thought of Rene Girard is kind of very interacting with the ideas of Jonathan Peugeot, the notion of mimetic desire, the scapegoat, and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to process through, even if you think, well, that's pretty philosophical and high-minded, but I think it really says a lot about where we are today, where we are in our culture today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to stress, Justin gave me this wonderful podcast, David Cayley, and I actually really enjoy David Cayley's work. And he's got like almost 6 hours of material on Girard, with mostly Girard talking
Yeah,
about his own work. So
yeah.
that's really what's informing a lot of this. It's not the only thing, but it's, and I had listened to Peugeot too, talk about Girard, like, oh, okay. But I think it's important to sort of frame Girard correctly, because one of the sort of things that I don't think people realize about Girard is that he's got earlier work and later work, except they're in different fields entirely. He starts out as a literary critic. Now, if that doesn't set off every alarm bell that exists in your brain, then you're going to struggle in life really hard, because I'm sorry to say, literary criticism is an invalid thing to try to do in the world, right? Like, if you're criticizing Shakespeare and Dostoevsky, I don't know how you can do that. Did you write something that lasted past your death that people still read and enjoy? No, then maybe you're not an expert in that enough to comment on it. That's just my feeling. Like, you can feel differently about it, I guess. I got questions if you do, but whatever. You do you. I'm fine with that. So that's kind of important, because he does criticize Dostoevsky and Shakespeare, and I was like, oh. And he also crits the Bible. And now I'm just like, that's a no. Like, that's just a hard no for me. I don't, I believe John Vervaeke's correct when he talks about distributed cognition. And if you add the through time part, that means the Bible's the smartest book that's ever been written. And if you're criticizing the smartest book that's ever been written, I'm sorry, I can't take you too seriously. And I think the thing that you're sort of pointing at, Justin, and Peugeot too, is that Girard amazingly talks about almost everything in the Peterson sphere, all the important stuff that's mentioned in the sphere of thought, and a few things that aren't talked about, or maybe aren't talked about correctly. Like, I think mimetic desire is amazing. I also think that Peterson and Vervaeke and Peugeot all talk about it in different ways, and they're using slightly different terminology, but they're pointing at the same things. And in this case, I think mimetic desire is actually the right term for it. So I find myself in the uncomfortable position of supporting some of Girard's work while condemning most of it, because, where does postmodernism come from? Exact literary criticism. Like, that's where it comes from. And my contention is still, there's no good in postmodernism. I don't make this claim lightly. I grew up in Boston. I've asked philosophers for this for decades. Like, please tell me what is good about postmodernism. I've never gotten an answer. I've never gotten a satisfactory answer. They can't answer the question. That is usually a good hint that something's up, when you can't answer an easy question like, well, what's good about this? Like, what can you use it for even, right? They can't even answer that. Like, and when they do, right, when they do, well, what can you use it for? You can use it to rip apart texts. I'm like, okay. So it's not good. Ripping things apart is not good, right? So what are you doing, right?
Yeah, it's
And so
more it's more like the reason why is because no one can figure out how to say it's wrong. That's why
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not because
yeah.
it's helping anybody, but because, like, well, I can't defeat it. I can't defeat it. So I guess it's here to stay. That's generally what you get
Exactly.
more with it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I think that's sort of the problem for me, is that, you're starting from sort of a bad place. But then he says some amazing things in really amazing ways. And I got a lot of insight out of what he was saying. And that to me is the most dangerous situation, where you have something good wrapped in lots of very bad stuff. And that's sort of going to be the case that I make. But before we get into all that, we kind of need to understand what is Girard's work, because there's a huge body of very good work here. And that's actually, I would call a lot of what Girard's talking about, whether it's his or not, is fundamentally important to understanding human behavior, the human condition, etc. And I, I I I think before we jump into, you're going to do a little presentation, Justin, for us. I do want to point out, because I have a bunch of notes here. I was just taking notes for 4 days. Um, I want to point out a bunch of sort of ideas that I think are really good, important points that intersect. I'm not going to point out all the, say, good ideas of Girard, but I want to point out the ones that intersect with the Peterson sphere, with the ideas that we're talking about, with what Vervaeke's saying, with what Peterson's saying, with what Peugeot's saying, right, and some of the others, right. I mean, some of this stuff sort of gets brought up by Martin Shaw, right, and all these other people that are sort of in this sphere, right. Um, uh, uh, the idea of mimetic desire for me links very, very nicely with a few different concepts. So one of the concepts Peterson talks about is that star that you go after, right? Like there's a star and you orient, and you might go in the wrong direction, but that's helpful because then you moved further away, right, from the thing that was outside of you that you were aiming at. Right? And that's a form of desire. All right, he's talking about a form of desire, and he's in some sense he's talking about mimicking a pattern to get there. You don't know what that pattern is yet, right? But you're trying to discover it. I think that's fair. I would say the way that sort of John Vervaeke talks about mimetic desire is not, we'll say the Peterson case is the exemplification piece, right? Like I want to reach this star, right? I want to get there, right? But Vervaeke sort of talks about mimetic desire more as his concept of participatory knowledge, right? It's like, well, yeah, what is participatory knowledge? Well, a lot of it is mimicking what other people do, right? And in that way, knowing that thing, right? That's how apprenticeship works, right? And a lot of people will dig into details and try to tear that apart in a literary critic way. But I think I went over why you don't do that. There's different ways to get to the same thing, but the fact is you're still mimicking the end result. And I think that's more important, is it's the end result. It's not the exact formulation. And that like distinguishing those two things is important, because sometimes you need to be exact and sometimes you don't, right? It doesn't matter how you get there, just so long as you get there. But it's not one or the other. So I think that's in there, and I think a lot of what Peugeot hints at is desire as well. And the thing about ritual, which actually Girard shreds ritual for reasons which make no sense to me, on grounds that are ridiculous. The reason for ritual is part of mimetic process. You're mimicking the tradition, right? That's what a good ritual does, right? It's not the only thing a ritual does. It's not the only kind of ritual, right? It's not all mimicry, right? Some is just necessary, right? The ritual of sitting down and eating breakfast is not, you're not necessarily mimicking anything there, right? But a lot of ritual is mimicry, right? You're mimicking what the people around you are doing, right? You're mirroring a different version of maybe what's happening on a stage, right? Or maybe who you're following, right? So they say something, you say something in response. That's part of a ritual. That's part of a mimicking, right? But you're not mimicking exactly the person that made the first statement, right? Because you're responding, right? And so I think that's really important to understand where that's coming from. And I, that I think is the attraction of Girard is that. But he also has other good points, a lot of which Vervaeke makes in his historical treaty from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, right, where he's talking about why the Enlightenment's bad. Right? He's talking about education as a form of imitation, right? And he links imitation to mimicry, obviously. And like these are important topics that keep coming up in the Peterson sphere. And he does mention things like the cross is more than a sign, right? There's something past a sign, right? And so a lot of the good work, the good themes that you hear in Girard are there in the sphere, and usually my thesis is still going to be being covered by everybody in some way, like being covered by all the people in some way. And I think when Pastor Paul Vanderklay talks about prophelicity, a lot of that is really around mimicry, right? What are you exemplifying? What are you looking for, right? And so you can see the way in which all these connected people in the sphere are talking about mimetic concepts in one way or another, right? Or desire, right? And Girard does link the two. So I think that's why we care. Like that's why this matters, right? Because it is a new way of looking at what Peugeot's talking about, what Viveki's talking about, what Peterson's talking about, right? And so why don't we jump into your little presentation book, because I found that fascinating. Let me just move you
Okay.
over here.
So this will be just going through a little summary of Girard. And the idea for this is just to get us on the same page before we go into maybe how we differ with Girard. So, okay, is this working?
Yeah, it's a little
Yeah.
crooked, but yeah, we're fine.
Oh, yeah, well, okay. Sorry. This will be like me reading a storybook to you. Okay. So this is by Carly Osborne, The Theory of Girard. I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of the key concepts here. Let's go to mimetic desire. Okay, so for those of you that are not familiar, let's just read a little bit of this, and you can stop me if you have something to add, or you want me to speed up or something. Okay, so the cornerstone of Girard's theory is the idea of mimetic desire. Mimetic comes from the Greek word mimesis, which means to imitate. The idea of mimetic desire is that our desires do not happen spontaneously from inside us, but instead we imitate the desires of others. So this guy says, I want a hat. And he says, let's call these two guys A and B. We call the A the subject, our main character. B is what Girard calls A's model. A admires B. He wants to be like B. He observes B, and he learns what to desire from B. If B desires, it becomes desirable in A's eyes. One way to represent this is with a triangular diagram. He thinks that his desire for the hat is a straight line between them, but really he gets to the hat via B. Sometimes Girard calls this triangular desire instead of mimetic desire. All right, so he talks about Don Quixote. I'm going to skip over that, but basically the idea is that that the reason why you want something is because the other person has it. You can see this in children when you see the one playing with a toy and then it doesn't care about the toy, and then another kid picks up the toy, and then it's like, hey, I want that, and then the person who has the hat, wants it even more, because now it's like, oh, you want this, now I want it even more, so
Mhm.
this is the height of it. So it's an escalating thing, so it goes from you didn't want it at all, and now all of a sudden, because the other person has it, you want it. So your desire is mediated by the desires of others. So this is an interesting part in the middle of the page here. If B is a fictional character in a movie, here, like Batman, then A can't really hate him because he doesn't exist. If B is A's favorite football celebrity, then A might be a bit jealous, but probably won't see B as his immediate rival. Instead, A feels that B is far above him in a world that's out of reach. B will never know about it. But if A and B are next door neighbors, then trouble is brewing. This is what he calls the height of the triangle. So it's basically you are only going to have this conflict that leads directly to violence, to fighting, when you're on the same level as the other person. So it's when it's your neighbor, when it's your immediate rival, when it's your twin, sometimes Girard says. So next door neighbors, that's the worst situation for this, because this is within reach. When it's Batman, when it's external, when it's some kind of, football player or somebody who's way out of your reach, or people have been talking a lot about, Taylor Swift lately, or something, or some kind of like major celebrity, then you're not going to see that person as a rival. You're just going to admire them, so this really kind of happens when it's your immediate neighbor. And so you now have a group this is how the mimetic crisis happens. A and B, now that they're neighbors, see each other as rivals. This is keeping up with the Joneses. The bonds and niceties that hold society together will strain under the pressure. Rivalry leads to resentment and eventually to violence. Each person wants to eliminate his or her rival. Violence is met with retaliation and more violence. You can think of like the mob movies, where it's like escalation of violence. So he says this is a big problem because happy, healthy communities need their members to feel allied with one another. Neighbors are there to help each other. We're on the same team. We're better together. However, it becomes this. This is what he calls all against all, where everybody is fighting with everybody else, and there's no in-group peace. There's no in-group cohesion. So mimetic desire leads to rivalry, which leads to what Girard calls mimetic crisis, which looks like this. So then now we get into a scapegoat theory, which is how do you escape this mimetic crisis? Okay, so here's how he says you do it. Here's how societies have traditionally done it, is they find the one person, the scapegoat, who they can blame all of their. So the real problem is mimetic desire and this conflict that that arises out of mimetic desire. But then you blame the scapegoat, you blame this one person and say it's that person's fault. And what does that do? It takes away, you go back to this, it's not all against all, it's all against one. So all these people here, they are now in harmony because they're all against this one scapegoat. So they all are unified in this, in thinking that this person is the problem, and not thinking that each one of them is the problem, or thinking that you yourself is the problem. So all of the members that were at each other's throats now see each other as allies in the fight against this guilty victim. So that's the main thing in his how he gets to the scapegoat ritual. Is that pretty good? Do you want to stop and talk about any of this, or should I keep going?
Yeah, let me add a few things in there.
Okay, let me go back to myself here.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think whoops, keep hitting the wrong buttons here. I think one of the sort of issues that I have is that a lot of the stuff he's talking about is explainable other ways too. And so while everything he's saying is true, it's not exclusively true. This is a common thing that we fall into. It's like we fall into a single explanation and we go, aha, it always works that way. And it definitely does not. And that's one of the problems, right? Because one of the ways he ends up using this rather explicitly in the interview with David Cayley is he at once talks about all this stuff like, oh, the scapegoat is guilty, and then it switches to the scapegoat is innocent. And I'm like, oh, that's not true. But another way to view this, and I think this is something that actually Peugeot is missing, which is weird to me that he missed this, is that sometimes when you have too large a margin, or when you have somebody too far out on the margin, you can't have cohesion, right? Because it's just too expensive for your culture, right? For your society, for where you're living. And you could look at something, because this is something Girard mentioned, like the witch trials as that. Oh, these people are just, we can't maintain them. Too expensive for us to sacrifice to maintain them. And if you put, we'll say, the recent context, or I can use modern as in the right now context on that, you can see that that's the battle. The so-called cultural war battle is a battle for resources, which Girard mentions, right? There's a battle for resources, ultimately, and how they get allocated. And the margin wants more resources for themselves. And it's like, well, you already have too many resources, and we all actually we're over allocating resources, especially in the United States. That's for sure. That's not just the deficit, right? We're over allocating time, we're over allocating attention, we're over allocating our energies, right, to doing very simple things that used to be very easy and are now very hard, right? And part of all of those costs comes from how much is being allocated to the margin, right? And so the sacrifice is necessary. Now, like I said, Girard switches from guilty to innocent on all victims. Very clever trick, but also a trick and also wrong. And so the
Well,
framework is
let's try to
good, but
explain that a little bit.
sure,
So this is let me see if I get that right in summarizing what his position is and what you
sure,
think. So basically, he says, okay, in mythology, in Oedipus Rex, or these different myths, you have basically a story where um, the from the point of view of the myth, you need to sacrifice this victim in order to stop whatever the problem is within the community.
mhm,
I don't know if this is from one of the books I read or from the podcast that you heard, but did you hear the story about the from 300 AD in, I think, Corinth, that one of the very last attempts at the old scapegoat mechanism?
no, I
Did you
didn't
hear?
hear that.
Okay, so this will be good. So this is the quintessential story that Girard thinks explains this idea. So in Corinth in 300, he thinks this is the last gasp of paganism. So his theory is that from the point of view of the ancient myths, you have the story is told from the point of view of the mob that wants to the all against one. It's told from the point of view of the all, not the one. And he says that the Hebrew story, starting with Joseph, inverts it and puts it from the point of view of the one, of the victim. So the story of Joseph is told from his point of view, and we identify with Joseph, not with the brothers that throw him down the well. You know, so he goes, that's how you can tell the difference between, let's say, the Judeo-Christian stories and the pagan stories. So he says in 300 AD, there's um, a, a priest or a leader who needs to keep the peace in this town, and so he there's a plague that befalls the city, and he says, "Well, I know how to fix this plague. It's that guy's fault, and it's this beggar." Okay, and they say, "Oh," and the people say, "Oh, really? It's that guy's fault, is it?" And they say, he goes, "Yes. You can tell by looking in his eyes." And then they look in his eyes, and what do they see? They see that he's got yellow demon eyes. And they say, "Oh my God, he is the problem." And he goes, "Well, what you need to do now is you need to stone him." And so that's what they do. They pick up the stones and they stone this demon. And then what happens? The plague lifts because it was his fault. It was the from the point of view of the myth. You know. So Girard then says, okay, that was pretty much the last time that this story was able to work to keep the peace. And again, it's only a temporary peace
Right.
because it's going to happen again, because that's not the actual source of the problem. The actual source of the problem is this all against all inner conflict, the fact that people fight with each other, not this one beggar. And he says, so what the Joseph story does, and ultimately what the Christ story does, is it tells it from the point of view of the one, and you realize that they're not the reason why you guys are fighting. And once that's exposed, it doesn't work anymore. Because now it's like,
Mhm.
oh, well, we can't just blame the black sheep in the family, for example,
Right.
like the one black sheep. Now that we know that that's just a trick, that's just unifying us only. Jonathan Haidt talks about this as well. You can unify over a common enemy, but that's different than other forms of unification. That's the lowest form of unification. Just because you're all Boston fans and you hate the Yankees, that's not enough to make lasting peace. That's just that's like a crutch. It's something that you can use to kind of paper over your actual problems, like alcohol would be to an alcoholic. Well,
Right.
you don't feel it anymore. You don't feel your problems anymore, but they're still there. The alcohol
Still
doesn't
there.
cause them to go away.
Exactly.
So then he says, when you reveal that story and you say, hey, it's not that beggar's fault. He doesn't actually have demon eyes. He's just a victim. And when you clear away all the rocks, you look and it's just a dead guy there. Then you go, oh, well, now we're just going to keep fighting with each other, because there's no, so
Right.
he thinks this is he puts it as the Luciferian, as the prince of this world way of keeping peace,
Right.
which is exposed by the gospel, he thinks. Um, so so innocent, not ultimately innocent, in the sense that we all have this beggar, if he was part of the community, would have mimetic rivalry and conflict with everyone else if he had a neighbor as well. So not innocent in that sense, but innocent in the sense of that's not the reason why you are fighting when you're
Right.
externalizing your conflict. Does
Right.
that sort of make sense of
Yeah,
his
I
position?
mean, it's clearly incorrect, right? Because actually plagues have starting sources and plagues have continuing sources. They don't have to be the same. And so the fact that the plague stopped at the stoning doesn't mean that Girard's right. It could mean that Girard's wrong, actually. See,
Mhm.
and that's something that slips past people, right? Because he's expanded the story past the window of the story, which is a trick that lit crits do all the time. Right. They say, well, this
Mhm.
story wouldn't be true if the story wasn't told under those conditions. It's an invalid
Mhm.
critique. I don't even what are you saying? And so it's not evidently true at all. B, it could be completely false. Could be completely false. The reason why that happened could be exactly because of that guy, right? Whether that was the source or not is a different, right? Because for the village, that might have been the source of the plague, or again, it might. We have, like the story of Typhoid Mary proves this perfectly, right? Like
Mhm.
Typhoid Mary didn't bring typhoid, like that, right? She got it. She just happened to
Mhm.
be asymptomatic, right? And then spreading it everywhere, and then wouldn't, right? And what happened was everybody was unwilling to sacrifice the woman to save all the people in the hospital. And so, right, so this is the reverse of what Girard's saying, right?
Yeah.
But the right
Well,
answer would have been to, and ultimately was, to sequester her and take her out of society because she couldn't help herself, right? She had this drive, this mimetic desire to help people, which is a good desire, right? But she was carrying a deadly disease, right? And so I get what Girard's saying, but he's wrong. Like he's absolutely wrong about that. It's not that
well, I
he's
would.
universally wrong about it, right?
Yeah.
Because it could be correct. But like anything can be correct if you change the parameters and the context. And that's the trick that lit crits always do. They change the parameters and context. Well, if you change the parameters and context, I can make anything true. That's not hard for me to do. I mean, other people have struggled with it, but like I can do that easily. So that's the, that's I'm like, it's sometimes a person's guilty and you have to give them up because they're
Well,
guilty.
yeah. What you're talking about is um, the when the Spanish come to the Americas and they're carrying with them a disease that community does
Mhm.
not have an immunity to. So
Right.
the mistrust of the outsider is valid and warranted in that
Mhm.
sense, because like, well, you don't know what they're bringing into the
Right.
community,
That's right.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
So
It's
what do you think of the comparison of Oedipus Rex to the story of Joseph? He thinks that they're opposite of each other, or he actually thinks that the story of Joseph is written in. He thinks that there were, if not Oedipus Rex, there were other myths around at the time that Joseph is sort of inverting, or at least um, saying that this form of keeping the peace is not right.
yeah, I think if it were keeping the peace in the Joseph story, to my limited understanding, it's absolutely not keeping the peace, right? It is about rivalry. It's definitely about rivalry, and it's about rivalry causing people to act poorly as a group. Agreed. When you put it in the larger context of what Girard does with all the Christian story, including Jesus, and to basically, on the one hand, claiming it solves the problem he's pointed to, uh, which is true in a way and false in a way. At the other time, he's indicting Christianity, which is a very clever trick that he does. And look, it's fantastically clever. Hats off to the way he manipulates his words and very subtly changes things over time. Also, I'm a no on evil, and that's evil. So I'm still a no on it.
Wait,
Like
what's evil?
lots of points for strategy and for accomplishing your goal. all points removed for having an evil goal. But yeah.
What's the evil goal? Oh, undermining Christianity, you're saying?
Yeah, I
Is
mean,
yeah.
he undermines. I mean, he makes insane statements, absolutely insane statements. Like at one point, he says that the Holy Spirit is the accuser of the accuser, and I was like, I don't know what Gnostic sect you got that from, but I
Mhm.
know it's a Gnostic sect, right? And the reason, like, there's all these little tells. Like, I actually have a list of tells in here. So one of the tells for when somebody's fooling you, and look, look, I'm not gonna indict the person fooling you. Okay, usually people lie to you to lie to themselves, and you're just like involved. Right? And like, I'm not a fan of being used so that you can lie to yourself. This is a lot of reason why people get very upset with me, but also that's too bad. Like, I don't want to be in on your conspiracy against your own will, right? Like, or your own goodness or whatever. I'm not interested. And so a lot of times people will do that. They will say, and this is especially where Girard throws his Gnostic, postmodern, nihilistic, parasitic, flat world theology, which is what it is. Um, they will use the word and reference the word in the definition, right? That's self-reference,
Mhm.
right? So to
Mhm.
say somebody or something is the accuser of the accuser,
Mhm.
that doesn't that you're not saying anything actually. If
Well,
you thought if you thought you heard something,
yeah,
the person didn't actually convey any information to you. That's the problem.
the accuser is the devil, right? The
It's Satan.
Satan is the
Yeah, yeah,
accuser.
right.
So he's saying the Holy Spirit is the one that exposes Satan for being Satan, right?
No, that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying he's
You
the
don't.
accuser of the accuser.
Well, the Satan to Satan. So if Satan means accuser, or the obstacle, Satan means
Right,
obstacle.
right.
So the obstacle to Satan's goal. That's not. You don't think that's
No,
what
he's
he's saying?
not saying he's the obstacle to Satan's goal. He's saying he's doing what Satan's doing. That means he's Satan. That's not true. This is why self-reference is tricky, right? Because you'll
Hmm.
you'll optimistically, in a Christian frame, as a Christian, read or Catholics. I don't like the term Christian. I keep using it. My bad. You'll read in the best possible interpretation, right? But
Hmm.
there's an infinite number of interpretations to accuser of accuser because you haven't defined either term, right?
Uh-huh.
And so you're going to read in whatever you want, but that's not what Girard said at all. And the unconscious implication of what he's saying is that actually the Holy Spirit's not a good thing either, right? Because they're both bad at that point, right? Because accusation is the thing that makes Satan bad, right? In most when you're using it in this way, that's not technically true. I understand that, but when you're using it in this way, that's what you're
Hmm.
implying, and then you're assigning that same property to the Holy Spirit. And I think that's invalid. And this is a typical postmodern trick. They use it all the time. This is funny to me because they use it all the time. I'm like, is somebody finally gonna clue in here that this is what they're doing? He talks about the critique of the critique, and I'm like, oh God, I understand that Immanuel Kant is somebody that people read. I don't know why,
Hmm.
but like the critique of critique is, as far as I can tell, his original not original, but he's the guy that wrote it down that everybody read for some reason.
The critique of pure reason. You're saying
Yeah,
Immanuel Kant?
I don't know which book it's in. Like
Hmm.
it's in one of these books. I don't know. I don't pay attention to any of these quote modern philosophers. There's no philosophy past Aristotle. If you think
Hmm.
otherwise, I will challenge you. And by the way, I've done this challenge many times and I always win. But hey, if you want to take a shot, go right ahead. Happy to have you. PhDs in philosophy, they all lose.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know what to say. This isn't hard, right? It doesn't have to be hard, right? You don't have to read in difficult thought into this. The idea that critiquing a critique is different from any other critique is impossible, right? Because what you're saying is there's a special status conveyed to looking at an idea that is fundamentally different from having your own idea or
Yeah.
having just an idea. And
Well,
that
yeah.
can't be true, right? That
It's the
can't
view
be
from
true.
nowhere. The
It's the
Thomas
view from
Nagel's view
nowhere.
from no. Yeah, you don't. You're
Exactly.
standing on nothing. Yeah. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
standing on nothing, or what I call is it objective material reality, OMR.
Hmm.
Right.
Right.
And all the scientists use OMR. That's why all the scientists are enamored with the postmoderns, or at least defending them.
Mhm.
And there's no defense for postmodernism. It just doesn't exist. I was onto this decades ago. Like I've been tracking down this Bigfoot for a long time, and there's no
Yeah.
defense of postmodernism. It just doesn't
Well,
exist.
it's what's interesting to me about Girard is that there's all of these people that are trying to get out of the problems that postmodernity arose from. They're in that world where there's I kind of like liken it to when you go to a rock climbing gym and they say you can't use that one. You can't use that handhold. You have to use the harder one over here. It's like, well, why? It's right there. Well, no, you're not allowed to use that. So like there's certain things in philosophy that happen where people said you can't just assume what we all know to be true. And you're like, well, why can't I assume that? We all know it's true, and they're like, well, because someone doubted it once and we can't
Yeah.
dissuage the doubt, you know?
Right.
And so
Right.
now you got to do all of this stuff to try to just say something normal. And so
Right.
Girard is getting, it seems to me like from that point, from deep within French intellectual, you know, the place where Foucault came from and the place where Derrida came from and everything, he's crawling and crawling and crawling his way to I think in the right direction where you're supposed to go, where he's finally, actually saying things like th- uh, that, you know, very Christian things, you could say. He's saying that the gospel, the gospel is what solves our problems. That's the deep rooted problem within the human heart is solved by the gospel. And
Right.
and ordinarily someone would say that and they'd say, well, okay, whatever religious kook, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about,
Right.
where he's saying getting enough traction to get people quite a ways down the road, I think, in terms of understanding certain fundamental things about the human condition, um, that I think would be very difficult to get ordinary folks that are immersed in this modern condition to understand.
That's potentially true for his postmodern intellectual audience, right? And I would argue, I mean, I think your assessment is perfectly correct. Like for the really hardcore postmodern people, he has that audience, right? And so he's acting as a Peterson figure and saying, no, no, there's something here, right? But at the same time, he talks about myth and then undermines it entirely in a very sneaky postmodern fashion. And that's what I'm saying is that as with all postmodern thought, it destroys itself immediately upon inspection, or just by letting it run its course. Like it will always do that because it can't get out of its own box. You can't have the critique of the, I mean, he actually says the critique of the critique and the critique of that critique. And I'm like, dude, do you not understand the trap that you've put yourself in for no reason? It's a made up trap. It's like if it's like one of the greatest movies of all time, War Games, right? A
Mhm.
strange game. The only way to win is not to play. That might be a hint that this is also one of those games. Like if you just never engage with postmodernism, you never have any of the problems that it creates, and then
That's
you
true.
don't have to solve those problems. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and again, like if you cast the problem of, we'll say, groups and the margin, just to be as Peugeotian about it as I can, and maybe maybe Jonathan will come and smack me around for this, but I'll go with it. If you cast that problem as a problem of mimetic desire alone, but it's the alone part that I'm going to emphasize in case that wasn't clear, right? Then you misunderstand the world entirely, right? Because one of the tricks Girard plays, and I don't know if anybody caught it in the little story, all desire comes from other people. So he never explains where the first desire comes from. Another postmodern trick, right? It's all reciprocal. It's all like was always there, right? It's and whenever anybody uses that formula, that particular tell, right, of not giving you the origin and not giving you a definition. Why did the first person desire the hat? Right. First, you have to explain where the first desire came from. Then you have to explain the mechanism of it. Right. And then you can explain all subsequent desires by mimesis. Right. But without that first mechanism, no desires ever exist to have mimetically. Right. So that particular trick is creation denial. What you're doing is you're actually just denying that there was a creation and that there are these mechanisms that are in place, however you want to think about them. A good Cathodox way to think about them is spirit, right? There are these spirits at play that are, we'll say, above you, right? That act inside of you, which is very confusing for people, which is why they don't talk about it that way, that cause you to pay attention to certain things. And some of those things you will come to desire. Right. And that is more closely related to like the Greeks' passions or something. Right. And that can happen for lots of reasons. Right. But we were created into a world where none of that is optional for us. We are subject to desires from spirits. It could be the spirit of cooperation, hopefully, right? Or it could be the spirit of competitiveness, because that's the other piece that is going to be missing later on. Is like, yeah, sometimes you see a basketball game and you're like, I want in, right? And then you're like, but which team do I want? And you sit down and you watch the teams and you're like, well, these teams seem unbalanced. And some people, their affect is to balance the teams. And some people, their affect is to be on a winning team. So they want unbalanced teams, right? Mimetic desire doesn't explain any of what I just outlined, any of it at all. Right. And so, but that's actually the difference between this mimetic cycle, this reciprocal cycle that he's actually talking about. I think he does use the word reciprocal at some point in the interview, right? That's the difference between reciprocally narrowing, right, and reciprocally opening, right? So there's some John Vervaeke for you, right? It's also the difference between feeling things are fair and unfair. So in a loss, you can feel the loss was fair or unfair, and you can blame the ref or you can blame the imbalance of the teams. And if that imbalance is caused by a particular person, right, it could be the person that I outlined. It could be the team picking strategy, like, oh, you let this person pick first, right? So yeah, I mean, he's leaving out all these alternative explanations and solutions to this very problem, right? Because those solutions involve personal responsibility. I think that's what they all have in common, by the way, right? He's always blaming the outside system for the violence, for the conflict, for the, for the issue. And I think that leaves out, if you want to frame it this way, because this is a fair way to frame it, the very Christian message of you take responsibility for it. And this is Peugeot's point when he talks about Girard, is Girard's missing the voluntary sacrificial aspect. That is correct. Girard never talks about that. It's always a group doing something to an individual. So do you want to continue with the story at this point?
Yeah, well, let's I think what you're getting to is the move that I would want to make after Girard. I think let me just summarize the rest of his theory without going back to the book. I think so basically what you're saying, what you just said about the origin of mimetic desire, he puts it as when the snake talks to Eve. That's the origin of mimetic desire, because Eve never wanted that fruit until the snake wanted the fruit. So it's when the snake, so there is something there, something in the sense of, and you probably, you can experience this where you're going along and then you don't care about something until this temptation comes, and the temptation is mimetic, so you're scrolling along on Instagram, and then all of a sudden, a desire that you didn't have before arises in you, because here you see, advertising works that way as well, where it's just, I didn't want a Lexus and now I do because, Matthew McConaughey is driving or whatever, so he's putting that as the kingdom of this world, the Luciferian is the mechanism of how it works is with this mimetic desire, but he ends in despair. This is, let me show you the last page of this book, actually, because
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think
because
it's a good idea.
once you go through the whole thing, you're like, oh my God, it's so depressing. Let's see. Let me go back to it. Let me find the page first, and then,
Yeah, he does sort of get to the point of depression and then pulls you
yeah,
out at the end because he's a hero. That's effectively
yeah,
what he's doing. Good to know that. Yeah, it's sort of
yeah.
important.
So, he gets up to the cross, and he says, okay, this is the ultimate inversion of, like I said before, the ultimate inversion of the myth, he thinks, where the
Right.
myth is saying, it's the fault of the outside person of why you have problems. And then now we have the cross as exposing that lie, which is, from his perspective, the lie of, it was this outside person who's your problem, and it's saying, no, that person, Christ, was actually innocent. And so, um it brings to light the scapegoat mechanism, um and then it ends with, let me see. this is how the this is more or less where Girard's theory ends. Humanity, driven by mimetic desire and rivalry, aware that scapegoating is perverse, but in denial, turning on more and more victims to try and get relief, returning violence for violence, cruising towards total apocalyptic war. Okay, so you read that and you think, really? Let me go back to myself here. You think, what does he mean by that? And because he has this phrase, and he says, the gospel is bringing the apocalypse. And what he means by that is, once you expose the scapegoat mechanism, it doesn't work anymore. And so now you're left with that all against all, because you have no external way of relieving
Mhm.
that pressure
Right.
valve. And so the
Mhm.
more the gospel goes in, and this is when I heard this, I thought, wow, that's quite a quite a move,
Mhm.
so as the gospel goes more and more into the world, into the culture, the more that scapegoat mechanism isn't going to work anymore, and the more conflict between people you're going to have. And so the gospel apocalypse means
Mhm.
reveal. So it'll reveal the fact that we're all just basically selfish deep down, and we will have no way of uniting our desires against this one common enemy. And so we'll all just fight with each other. And so therefore we're just headed towards destruction and an apocalypse. And that's where he ends. He doesn't never picks it up from there.
Right.
Um, and the
Right.
reason is because this is where I think you want to go with Peugeot, is that he does not understand. He never brings in the martyr. He never brings in
Mhm.
the positive form of sacrifices, which is where you are
Right.
sacrificing something up to, and you're unified now, not over the common enemy, which is Jonathan
Right.
Haidt in The Righteous Mind. He talks about, you can unify over your common enemy, but there's another way of unification. And the unification is really, I would say, worship is a good word for that. A
Yes.
common sacrifice upward towards a common good, the highest good. That's what unifies you, rather than your common enemy, and this is where I think he never quite makes it. And this is, I think, where Peugeot wants to go, and probably where you want to go.
Yeah, so what I would say is, what you described, and I agree with most of it, although we'll have to tussle on the advertising stuff. Um, these are flat world ways of thinking about the world. Okay, this is when I say the flattening of the world, the reduction or compression of the world. This is one of the things. It's not the only thing I'm talking about. There's lots of ways to flatten the world. One is time. Right?
Mm,
One is just ignoring everything that came before you, and then there's nothing to be grateful for. By the way.
mm,
So anytime someone's not talking about gratitude, they're probably compressing time. Good to know, right? That's one form of flattening. But another form of flattening is just this leveling thing. And that's when people talk about reciprocal blah, right? Especially with no beginning and no end, or no beginning and an end where everything is obliterated, right? There's the nihilism in Girard.
mhm.
Um, that's a flat world, right? They have a closed system and it's very flat. And that's how you get into this tit for tat. Tit for tat's a term that he used. And I was like, there is a tit for tat sometimes, right? But the resolution to, what came to mind, especially when I was re-listening to Peugeot. Thank you for those videos, by the way. I'd actually heard them all. And there
Mhm.
were a few others that I thought I had missed. In fact, there's a few others that aren't in your list that I was like, I know he's mentioned Girard a few other times, right?
Yeah.
In a more skeptical way, where he also gives him more credit. These were sort of negative towards Girard, which is fine by me.
Mhm.
But like, one of the things he sort of talks about is, yeah, Girard is not accounting for the positive side of sacrifice. He's not accounting for giving up. And this is the flat, right? You get a flattening. It's just nothing to give up to. But he doesn't also account for the fact that in the Hatfields and McCoy, for example, the reason why that rivalry happens and escalates sort of infinitely is because there isn't an authority. And that's actually part of the story. Like, whether you believe it or not, right? I mean, it definitely happened, but whatever. You don't have to believe the Hatfields and McCoy. It's an archetypal story, right? The the there are multiple ways to resolve it, but what didn't happen, and it is part of the story because it's part of the set and setting, which is super important. No authority came in and said enough. No one said
Mhm.
there has been enough bloodshed and there shall be no more. And the interesting thing is, while I was thinking about all this, I made all these notes, and then I remade the notes. Like, I summary, tells, good points, obvious lies, contradiction, self-reference, right? Problems of evil, or patterns of evil, rather. Corrections and alternatives, right? Which I
Mhm.
did, right? And then the Peugeot stuff, just Peugeot and Girard, which is a quicker section, right? One of the things I realized is that you see this pattern of stopping all over the place in an escalation pattern. It happens all over the place. So the most recent place I saw it, because I'm rewatching the Battlestar Galactica reboot, um, fascinated, right? I watched the miniseries and I went, "There's all the meaning crisis stuff. It's right there." I don't know why I didn't, because I saw it when it came out. I don't know why I
Mhm.
didn't see it then, but I did. I did. I mean, I thought it was great, right? And then it sort of went off the rails for sure. But like, wow, it was right there all along. There's as the series goes on, because the miniseries is just like a starter teaser thing, but actually itself contains meaning crisis. There's a scene where they go on a witch hunt, right? And
Mhm.
eventually, the lowly person on the chain gets permission for a quote free hand, and then goes after the commander. And the resolution is, the commander says, "We're done now."
Hmm.
Right. And the moment of tension in that particular scene is, of course, uh, the lowly officer, the security, she's the head of security or something, right? Um, and she basically tells the guards at the door, make him sit back down. And he walks up to the guards and says, "Take her out and escort the rest of these people back to their ships." That's the point of tension in the episode. And then
Mhm.
you see this also in Star Trek Next Generation. It occurred to me, right, where I think it's called Witch Hunt. Even it might even be a two-parter, but basically the admiral goes nuts, starts going after everybody in the ship, and then escalates right up to the captain. And eventually Picard just has to say, "Admiral, you've lost your mind. We're not doing this anymore." Picard's not an admiral. Like, I don't know
Mhm.
what to tell you about how this works, but like, somebody stands up and ends the conflict. And Girard doesn't account for anything like that. And that's not the only way either, because most of these conflicts actually end with a close enough sacrifice, because that's really what this is all about, right? And you can say, "Mark, you don't know what you're talking about." I lost a house and all my mother's stuff. I could escalate that, right? Like, I could go out and shoot people.
Mhm.
That you know I would not feel unjustified to do that either. Like, there was some injustice done to me, for sure. I got stuff taken from me that I worked for my whole life, more than once, right? By clearly evil people, well documented, by the way. You can look this up. It's all in court cases, right? It's all filed in court documents. Um, I could escalate that, right? Or I could choose to end the conflict, right? Which is
Mhm.
what I've done. And so, right. And so, what Gerard's saying can be true. It's just not
Yeah.
very often true. And
Well,
again, that's where
that's a
that's where we get
sacrifice.
into trouble.
that's a sacrifice.
It's a
To
voluntary
end
sacrifice.
conflict is that's you sacrificing on your side rather than sacrificing on the other side.
It's a
You know, that
voluntary sacrifice, right?
yeah,
Well, that's what
yeah.
that was to prove your point about Peugeot's point, which is
Hmm.
he's not
Yeah,
accounting for voluntary sacrifice. He's saying
yeah,
all sacrifice is external and caused by the mob, and that's just patently false. It's observably wrong, and we have all kinds of stories about this, like all kinds, and they're very like those two episodes that I mentioned of those two shows. Those are very popular episodes for that
yeah,
reason,
yeah.
right? And they're not the only ones. Those are the two that popped into my head most recently. I don't know why the Next Generation one popped into my head. I haven't watched Next Generation in ages, but almost all science fiction will run into that too,
Yeah.
because it's a common struggle of humanity, right? And so yeah, I mean Girard completely misunderstands the message in the Bible about sacrifice because he can't give up. There's no up. There's no what we would refer to this as in the Peterson sphere is vertical causality. Right? There's no
Mhm.
vertical causality in Girard's world. He outlines a flat world explicitly. He's not hiding the ball, right? In that he's hiding other balls. He's not hiding that ball. He's saying, "Oh, this happens." Right? He's not giving you any alternatives. So it's not only a flat world, it's a pretty lame one. It's like there's only one way, right? And then I'll loop this back to a slight disagreement on your characterization of advertising. Like the good form of advertising is letting you know that there is an option available to you that might be worth it for you
Yeah, yeah,
without appealing to mimetic desire, because there's lots of other desires, right? So one
yeah,
common trick in advertising, I'm sure you know, everybody knows this, right, is to just put the object and a beautiful woman. Problem solved. Now you're not trying to mimic anything there, right? You might be trying to obtain something, but that's not mimic, right?
right.
Mimicry causes the desire to obtain, but it is not the only reason why you would have a desire to obtain. Again, this is the trick that Girard plays, probably on himself. Again, to be fair, right?
Mhm.
Not that I particularly feel like being fair to Girard, but I'm just showing you I could be fair. If I, I'm going to be fair, even though I don't want to. There's another sacrifice, right? And so, in essence, um, that concept is really important, right? Because if you don't have an up, and if you don't have alternative explanations for why desire happens, right? You just reduce all desire because he does this sneakily. This is sneaky. He reduces all desire to mimicry. Uh, that can't be true. That's ridiculous, right? And
Mhm.
and that's part of the problem. But that's a reduction, a flattening, right? And
Mhm.
this is where people get into trouble, especially we'll just call them the so-called quote modern philosophers. He's a modern philosopher, but all philosophers past Aristotle, and I do mean all of them. It seems to take me approximately 20 minutes to prove this for any random philosopher someone comes up with. And that's been pretty consistent for 30 years. I'm gonna say there's a there there. I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say that's probably going to be true for all of them. Uh, so what that means is that they're all flattening the world. And like, look, in order to understand something, you have to flatten. This is the science trick of science, right? It flattens everything down. The whole way science works is you reduce the number of free variables to the smallest number that you can, right? The first variable you constrain is time in science, by the way, right? Because you can't define rust. Everything's rusting all the time. Every single object you know of is rusting all the time. That's not helpful, right? It's
Mhm.
universalism. It's another trick people play. So science constrains the definition of rust down to some time period, usually constrains it some time period for some kind of object. Usually the useful time periods, of course, are time periods that are within our use of the object, not our lifetime, right? But our use of the object. Like a baby doesn't care if a hammer's going to rust on them, right? You also wouldn't buy a baby a hammer, like they don't need one. You might
Mhm.
you might a 3-year-old a hammer, right? And how long that lasts might matter, right? So you can see the way in which constraints play into this. And what Girard does, or one of the things he does, is he never talks about constraints, right? He only talks about actions that lead to things. He never actually discusses the natural constraints of the world, right? And I think he's not the only one that does this. A lot of people just
Mhm.
ignore constraint as such. And I think in advertising in particular, what you're looking at is more to Peugeot's point of the world is attention. Right. And then how that attention is manipulated is important, right? Or how it manifests is important. It's not always manipulated. That's the conspiratorial thinking, the skeptical cynicism that everybody has, right?
Mm.
And so if I show you a Lexus and I show you a cool person driving a Lexus, maybe you'll want to drive a Lexus. But if I just, in most car commercials, at least I don't know recently because I don't watch that much TV anymore, but they used to be just the car with no people and a bunch of specs. Right?
hmm
People
Yeah.
like me love this because I'm
Yeah.
immune to the beautiful woman, the fancy,
You just
the
want a
Matthew McConaughey.
solution to what you're trying to do, and
Yeah,
this is giving you the best solution. Yeah, that's the most positive form of advertising, is connecting something that you could actually use, putting it in
right.
your attention so that you know
Yeah,
it's available to you. Yeah,
exactly. And that's why I don't like it when people are cynical about advertising and marketing, because there's lots of good forms of advertising and
sure.
marketing, and what you're effectively doing is saying it's all bad, so you don't have to make a decision about it because it's choices are
Well,
hard.
trust me, I work on a lot of commercials, so I'm with a lot of these agency people, and Art Center College of Design, where I went to college, is a big advertising uh,
Oh,
college. Very, very commercial. So no, I know exactly what you mean. What I don't like about the world that we live in sometimes is I actually have to cut myself off, like I was saying, like from Instagram. Like I cannot have Instagram on my phone unless I really, really work hard at curating that feed to have generative things in there, because
right,
there's so much of this other thing coming. And so this is where I think it's interesting to interact with uh with these figures, like someone like a Girard, that you say he's getting a little slice of how human, let's say, desire works, and he's getting that little slice right. And you're saying it doesn't cover everything, which is true, you know. Um, but I think that it's useful to get that, to understand that little slice, so that now you know what to do about it. Maybe he doesn't give you what to do about it, but
that's
I
the
think that
point.
there are resources there, that you can say, okay, that's a pretty good diagnosis of something that happens in our lives, and it explains, when you got in the nursery with the two kids fighting with each other, it explains a lot of things. And like I said, his thing just finally ends, and
Right,
it's you have to add on to it.
right.
So that's why I'm interested in your what it is that you thought his good points were. You said part of your notes were the
I'll
things
go
that
through
you.
them all. Yeah, let's go through them all. Let's be as fair as I possibly can, despite my complete discomfort at even platforming the idea of Girard. And I mean that technically. Like I'm
Mhm,
very reticent. And I'll start by pointing out the following. This is where people get into trouble a lot, is they
mhm,
find an answer, right? They find a system that answers a question or a problem or seems to pull things together in a way that gives them a level of coherency that they did not have before, right? And that can be very, very useful. But then they universally apply it. And this is extremely common, and it's almost impossible for you to avoid by yourself on your own. That's where people get into trouble, right? And so autodidacts, not saying anything against autodidacts, okay? Let's not be stupid about this. I'm an autodidact. I didn't go to college at all, ever. Right? Like everything I know, I learned pretty much on my own, largely. I mean, even when I was in school, like, and I read all my school books before I went, when I went to private school because I could, and then I get upset when they didn't cover the whole book for the year. I was like, "What are you doing?" All right, so like, I'm not saying anything against autodidacts, but also, right, if you're trying to do this by yourself on your own, which I did not do, thank goodness, um, you're going to lead yourself astray. Like guaranteed, guaranteed. It's not optional. It's not like, well, I'm going to do these things.
yeah.
That's not going to happen,
Or
right? You
or here
need
here's an
other people.
example. I have an example of that. So I think this is what you're saying. So your car breaks down. Imagine your car breaks down, and the only thing you know about are carburetors.
Yeah,
So that's the only thing that you can think that might be wrong with it. And you're like, well,
yeah.
I fixed the carburetor, and it still doesn't run. And
Those are-
why? Well, it's just because there's a lot about it that you don't know. So
Right.
you try to diagnose it with only one problem when in
Right.
fact it could be any number of problems. That
Right.
doesn't mean that that there aren't if the carburetor is broken, then that's a good thing that you know about that. But if that's the only thing you
Right.
know and you try to apply it to every single time your car breaks down, you're only going to fix your car a couple times.
Right. But then when the car doesn't work, you blame the car, and you don't
Yeah.
think to blame yourself and your lack
Yeah.
of knowledge.
Or
And it's
yes, the fact that it's a complex system and there's way more going on than you are aware of. You can't just reduce it all down. That's a flattening you're talking about. Yeah. So anyway, I agree.
right, but but it's the results of that I'm pointing at. Like if you're
Mhm.
angry and resentful, it's because you made that mistake. That's
Yes.
that's almost certainly what it is. Right? You
Mhm.
have a misunderstanding of the world, and that's what makes you angry and resentful. When you understand the world, you don't get angry and resentful at random things or the world, you get angry and resentful at certain specific instances and people. And you can identify their corruption and their bad behavior. And if you can't do that, you've basically done this to yourself. All right, and that's where the problem comes in. Is it's very hard for you to see where you're tunnel visioned in. It's just you can't
Yeah.
do it by definition, right? And so, uh, you know, acquiescing to other people, even though we know they're going to be wrong about things, is your best bet. It's still your best bet, right? It's your only and best bet. It's like, even though they're going to screw up too and lead you astray for sure. Like that's definitely 100%
Yeah.
going to happen. Right? Do you rely on lawyers for expertise all day long? And I can tell you, uh, you, you have no choice, and the odds they'll lead you astray are very high because they don't know their
Mm.
business all that well
But
either.
at
Right?
least you when you're working it out with other people, at least your blind spots and their blind spots might not be the same one, you
Hopefully,
know?
right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why I don't actually like people who agree with me. I mean, this is why I like Manuel Post because he'll just tell me when I'm wrong, very loudly usually,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he's often right about that. Right, and this
Mhm.
is super important. Like, I hate being around people who, won't even tell me that my microphone is screwed up on Discord. I'm like, you could just tell me, like I could fix it. Like I don't. Right, and it's
Yeah.
that conflict avoidance, right? Which you could come to that through Girard very easily. Oh yeah, we just need to avoid conflict because that's basically what Jesus did. That
Uh-huh.
that isn't there, by the way. You misread the Bible. I'm just going to tell you that right off the bat.
Yeah.
That's not there.
Didn't avoid
But
conflict.
it's very easy to get there. A lot of people get there. They get to hippie Jesus pretty quickly.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
when Girard's taught, and this is the trick that Girard uses, like he drops these nuclear weapons of understanding that are like, wow, almost none of them have anything to do with his mimetic desire theory.
Mm.
Another tell, by the way, right? He's dropping things that aren't don't play into his theory at all. So one of the things he talks about is he does talk about desire separately. He says it's changeable by nature and is shaped by those around us, those we admire, right? What he leaves out is attention as a factor, right?
Mhm.
He doesn't mention that. And so the world as attention comes to mind from Peugeot, obviously, right? Like that's super important. Um, and he does talk about wanting what others want can create rivalry, right? But it can also create cooperation, right? Like
Yeah.
I want a cathedral, you want a cathedral. Maybe we both start to try to build a cathedral, and maybe we both suck. Like I'm a wreck from my illness, so I'm not gonna be
Mm.
building anything with stone anytime soon. Uh, right? So maybe I just contribute to the effort, right? Or maybe
Yeah.
I work on the drawings, or not that I can do that, but like someone can, someone who's an architect can, not me. I'm not
Mhm.
an architect, right? And so wanting what others want can create rivalry, but it doesn't have to,
Yeah.
right? And it's the doesn't have to part, right? Where and he does mention this in the Ten Commandments thing, and I'm like, well, that's one way to read it. There's other ways to read that particular commandment, right? Whereas
Mhm.
you can turn that into cooperation instead of opposition, right? Because
Mhm.
to oppose means to set apart. Like you're doing that. It's not a feature outside of you, right? Opposition is something you do to the world. The world doesn't do that to you. Right? And that's where people get confused. This is actually what Girard's talking about. He's saying oh, the world opposes me, and it probably does, because Girard, I don't know, man. I can see why you don't want to engage with his work, or you find him.
Mm,
I mean, he's criticizing Shakespeare and Dostoevsky. For me, it's already a no, right? Like, can't do that. Um, it's not all like that, right? And it doesn't have to be like that. Opposition is actually something you do. Like, you can oppose the world, and then the world will oppose you. That absolutely will happen. That's not the world's fault, though. That's actually your fault. Maybe you have to sacrifice and give something up to the
yeah,
group to be part of the group, because that's how groups work. I mean, this is one of Peugeot's points when he's talking about Girard. That's how groups work. We all
yeah,
sacrifice something, right? Like, you're sacrificing your time, energy, and attention to be here. I'm sacrificing my time, energy, and attention to be here for the audience.
yeah,
Was that hard to figure out? Because I mean, people don't think of it that way. Fair enough. Like, I'm not denigrating anybody, but like, we're doing this, right?
mhm,
And it serves lots of purposes. That's where people get confused, right? It's not like money and power will be ours because my YouTube channel
yeah,
is monetized and Justin gets
yeah,
to put his ideas about Girard. Like, come on, that's going
mm,
to happen because we're on a video. Like, I
yeah,
don't know what to tell you about our intent is to discuss this and work it through, and hopefully help others discuss it and
yeah.
work it through. And look, I mean, I'm sure, Justin, I don't want to speak for you. You'll correct me, but like, maybe somewhere in the back of both our minds, we're like, maybe Peugeot will see this, and for me, it's just he'll find it useful, right?
Yeah,
He'll pay attention
yeah,
to us, like, we'll
sure,
be part
sure.
of his world.
Well, here's an example, I think, of what you're talking about, the two ways of unification. Okay.
Mm,
I remember when, and I'm a Dodgers fan, so and I always go back to sports, when they had so much money. It was around 2012, 2013, and they hired all these stars, but there was no cohesion. They were having rivalry among their own team,
right.
like the Yankees in the 70s or whatever, where they're all big stars, but they don't have the right goal, which is to come together as a team and win the championship. They have these other goals that are in conflict. Okay. So they were losing, losing, losing. And then something happened, and then they went on a winning streak that's the best winning streak in the whole history of the team. And guess what the thing was that happened that caused this winning streak? It was a brawl with the Arizona Diamondbacks. So
Oh,
they're all fighting with each other, okay? And then they had this brawl, and it was one of the biggest brawls I've seen in baseball, where they just, they were just going at it for 5 minutes, it seemed like. And then all of a sudden they went 45-5 or something like just an insane run.
wow.
And I realize, I mean, reflecting on it now, I think that's the Girardian, um,
Yeah.
that is a common enemy unifying, so they got into a brawl, and then they unified over the common enemy, let's say.
Yeah. Sure.
But that's not the only way you can unify a sports team. Now, if you're a coach, you think to yourself, okay, I got to get this team into a brawl so that they'll cohere, so that they'll unify, right? There's another way of doing it. And the other way, I would say, would be if your best player started sacrificing up to the greater good. So
Right.
in today's team, you could take, Mookie Betts has a certain work ethic and a certain
Right.
attitude and a certain demeanor, and he does stuff that causes positive imitation. It
Right.
causes people to say, "Oh, okay, this is how you do it. This is true maturity. This is so it's like sainthood, you could
Yep.
say. He's a
Yep.
baseball saint. He's exemplifying a certain, and that is a way of unifying a group that is
Yep.
not based on having a fight. It's not
Right.
based on violence, let's say. Okay. So that's not the only way that you can, but Gerard is right in that sense, that brawl unified the team and caused them to stop fighting with each other, at least for
Right.
a time.
Right, but that's contrary to mimetic desire in that instance, and Girard doesn't mention that. Like, often he'll give you an example of something that he's talking about that does not fit his model at all.
Mhm.
And I will make a claim here, and this is a tentative claim. I'm not going to stand by it. I thought I could hear his amusement when he was doing that. He knew what he was doing. He knew he wasn't giving you the right example.
Hmm.
Uh, I I could have imagined it. That's thoroughly possible, but I don't think so.
Mhm.
That's all I'm going to say about it. Um, and so yeah, that's not a mimetic thing. Like mimicry didn't cause that, right? But the mimicry
Mhm.
can fix that instead of the sacrifice, right?
Mhm.
Instead of the
Yeah.
right. And you know, that's the wanting what others want can create rivalry, right? Your second example, or they can create better baseball team.
Mhm.
It could go either way, man. All right, but that's up to the individuals involved, actually, or the persons involved, I should say, and that's part of the problem. And it's not always the case that the closer we are to someone, the more conflict we have. That I mean, and I have that under good points. It's a good point because there's more opportunity for conflict the closer you are. Absolutely there, right? And so it seems like a
Mm.
very obvious thing, right? But it's not true because you can turn conflict into cooperation or you can substitute it, right? And that's people always miss that because it's hard. It's hard to do, it's hard to think of in the moment, right? And it's not obvious. But I think something, I'm glad you brought up saints. I think something like saints helps with that, right? And so if you don't have them, that can be a
Yeah.
problem. I mean, I would argue you do. You can say you don't, but that's gonna happen, right? Because you need exemplification. You need something to mimic, and the saints just maybe they give you one, or maybe they give you a bucket of things that you want to mimic, right? But not all of them, right? Because there's only one.
Yeah.
We'll say one archetypal symbol for that, at least in Catholic thought, right? Um, and that's only all encompassing in a way, and that's actually probably where we get into trouble with the divine feminine and the hidden matriarchy and things like that. Is just focusing on the one sort of male represented archetype instead of also focusing on the female
On
representative
Mary.
archetype,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I make a distinction between Catholics and Christianity, because the things people call Christianity that are missing, a big piece, and also don't have anything in common, right? Because the way they want to quote follow Christ is different. So I don't.
Sure. Yeah.
So you didn't say, well, we all follow Christ, but we all do it differently. And I'm like, well, then you're not in the same club, and you're not the
Follow
same
your
thing.
own Christ.
And you right, and you can't.
Yeah.
Well, it reduces to that, and
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me. Like Girard makes that point later on. Actually, he uses de Tocqueville to make it, which I know about de Tocqueville, but I never read his stuff, and now that's going in my book club. So we're gonna do
Oh,
book club on de Tocqueville at some point.
oh, sorry. I got to change my battery on my camera here.
Uh-oh. Okay. Well, go ahead. I'm gonna go through more of his good points
Yeah.
while you do that.
Go ahead.
So while he's right that the closer we are to somebody, the more conflict you have, it doesn't have to be that way, right? This is optional. And Girard doesn't talk about optionality, right? He just talks about this is the way it is. This is the way it is. It's very, very sneaky thing that he does actually. And then he says, like, mimicry means judgment is inevitable, and others judge you unconsciously. I mean, I think that's I mean, that's an implication. I don't think he says it outright, but that's an implication from what he's saying is that to mimic is a judgment of value, right? For me to want something that you want, that's creating the value. I mean, that was in your original example of the hat. Like that creates the value, or the kid's toy. That creates the value. The wanting creates the value. Um, but that's a judgment. Like all value happens through judgment. You can't get around judgment, right? You don't
Mhm.
live in the hippie Jesus judgment free world. That didn't ever happen and can't ever happen to you, right? And so um, he he goes through that idea, uh, which I think is important. But yeah, like he doesn't do anything with that idea. He doesn't do anything about judgment at all, right?
Mhm.
Which is interesting, right? Because he does tend to flatten everything to, well, the victim is innocent at the end, and I'm like, hey, victims aren't all innocent. Scapegoats are almost never innocent, right? Yeah, you might pile on a few extra charges that are untrue to them. That certainly happens, right? Because justice is imperfect and people are imperfect, and we live in an imperfect world. I don't know. I don't know. Are you okay after I revealed that, or like a lot of people seem to be assuming perfection all the time, and I'm like, I don't like what world are you living in? Um, but to mistake that for some kind of deliberate attempt, right? Because a lot of people don't know, right? The number of people that I try to explain, no, the banks in 2008 just committed basic fraud. They just lied about what assets they held on
Mhm.
paper, right? They just did that. And they don't believe me. And I'm like, okay, well, 60 Minutes actually did a special on a company that was forging documents for the banks. And then they really don't believe me. Right? And why? Well, because if that happened, that would be a scandal and people would do something about it. And that did happen and it wasn't a scandal and nobody did anything about it. And you can watch 60 Minutes episode if you want. I don't know what to tell you, right? That happened, right? But it's too big a truth for people to handle, right? That's, you can't handle the truth. You want the truth,
So
you can't handle the truth.
so you're saying that the what's the scapegoat in that situation? Or the supposed scapegoat?
No, what I'm saying is there is no scapegoat. The reason why there isn't a scapegoat is
Mhm.
because like the banks did all that. It's like they did, and they knew they were doing it, and
Sure.
a company was created to facilitate their fraud,
Mhm.
and there was no scapegoat. So what does that mean? I mean, this is where Girard's correct again, right? Like that's going to build up and come back to bite us.
Mhm.
You think the 2008 banking crisis is over? No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, nothing changed. Nothing. A bunch of people stole a bunch of money from the taxpayers, right?
Mhm.
Some of that money went to overseas. In fact, most of it, because we were hiding the fact that we were lying about what we were doing at the government level. Um, that's coming back to soon. Trust me, that's coming back soon. This is something I'm going to claim a lot of expertise in after hundreds of hours of research on my lawsuit. Like
Mm.
that's here and now. You might want to know why you can't cash a check for $5,000 without a hassle and a delay. It's 2008 banking crisis and the fact that we didn't fix the core problem. Uh, that's
Mhm.
that's why. Uh, that has huge implications, by the way. But
Right.
nothing you and I can do anything about at all. So you can worry about it if you want, but it's nothing we'll do will fix it. Because again, it's too big a lie, and the scapegoat wasn't meant. So Girard didn't talk about that either. What if the scapegoat isn't there? Like he just talks about the scapegoat as a bad thing. Eventually, he morphs into it, right? But
Mhm.
actually, like we have to punish bad people. Like, otherwise, things get worse because they keep doing the bad thing, and other people keep mimicking their bad behavior, right? And so the people in the banking crisis next time won't be the people who were in the banking crisis last time because a lot of them will have retired, but they're mimicking a pattern that they don't understand, right? That is
Mhm.
bad, that they don't know is bad. Because if it were bad, how did they do it before? It's a
Mhm.
good question. Well, the taxpayers paid a heavy price for that, right? That debt's not off the books. That was 2008 was a long time ago. I don't know if you know that. That's a lot of years ago, right? That debt's not off the books. That we're still paying that debt. We're paying interest on that debt. That's not good, right? And people are still doing the pattern that caused the problem. So that problem's coming back, right? This is Nassim Taleb makes this point in numerous places. Um, so that we're caught in that, right? Because the judgment isn't happening,
Mhm.
right? The judgment isn't there, and that's where Girard fails. He fails to judge: is the victim innocent or guilty? Because that actually does matter. I mean, he claims it doesn't actually, and I'm like, oh no, that innocent victims are very different from guilty victims. Like guilty victims are, in some sense, getting what they deserve.
Mhm.
Innocent victims are acting as a release valve, but making the problem worse. So that's different. Making the problem better by removing the problem, and making the problem worse by removing something that isn't the problem, right? And that goes back to that story you told earlier, that myth you told earlier about the guy with the yellow eyes, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
you know, but again, that story could go either way, right? So that story's not a good example because it's actually not clear from the story whether or not that's true. Girard is, interestingly, presuming a scientific frame and assuming that frame is correct, when in fact, even in the scientific frame, that story is not
Mm.
true. It could be true, but it's not necessarily true. And that's where people get into trouble, right? Again, is they speculate on the frame. Very postmodern thing to do is speculate on the frame. But the idea that the one cannot stand for the many, I think, is actually a good idea by Girard. Like that is true. Like the one cannot stand for the many. Um, but also that's not how hierarchy works. And so when you say the one cannot stand for the many, you're implying equality. And that's equality doctrine. And equality doctrines are all wrong. And every single one of them will destroy the world. You shouldn't ever adopt an equality doctrine. I mean, I'm not equal to you. You're not equal to me. You do filmmaking. I can't even conceive of how hard that is. It's like, I can't get my lighting correct, Justin. I mean, come on. And sound is impossible. I've said this before. Pastor Paul agrees with me. Sound is impossible. I don't know how anybody does sound ever.
Right.
Right? It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are those the two hardest things in film is lighting and sound? And
From the technical point of view, yes. The hardest part is making a story work. Making something work is very difficult to figure out. But yeah,
oh,
technically,
that's really
sound.
I can do that. That's easy. We should talk. We definitely. Like I can just show you how to make any story work. That's not hard. That's not hard for me. You can do my lighting and sound. I'll do your story fixing.
Yeah.
Done.
Perfect.
Yes, perfect. We'll cooperate. I won't
Yeah.
I won't be rivalrous of your skills. I'm not saying any of them. Thank you.
Yeah.
As long as you're not rivalrous of mine, so we don't have to fight. Like
Yeah.
yeah. Like so many duos do, right? That's a very common trope, especially in
Mhm.
music. The musical duos tend to the person who writes and never sings versus the guy who
Yes.
sings. They always those
Right.
almost always break up,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And yeah, like Girard doesn't cover that sort of thing, like how long things
Sure.
can last, right? And the
Mhm.
fact that things degrade over time, that's not that doesn't fit in his system, right?
Mhm.
I sometimes things are fruitful for a while and then they're not anymore. That happens a lot in business. All right, and the business continues, right?
Mm.
And like you see that too, like I don't know, do you know the band Genesis?
Yeah.
So there's a famous thing about Genesis where one of my musician friends said he's not just a musician; he's unbelievably brilliant. Um, but he and another friend of mine we're talking about Genesis. I know nothing about music. It's sad, right? But they were talking about Genesis, and they said the thing about Genesis is early Genesis is good, but when Peter Gabriel leaves Genesis, Peter Gabriel is better without Genesis, and Genesis is better without Peter Gabriel. Not a bad thing. Uh,
Yeah.
from what limited information I have about that, like when Peter Gabriel was doing, I believe he did solo shows while he was with Genesis, and they were terrible. It wasn't until he left Genesis and did solo that he got better, for
Hmm.
whatever core reason in the background.
Yeah.
But like that pattern happens too,
Mhm.
right? And so sacrificing the band member in that case, I just made everything better for everybody. Right? And well,
Yeah.
you have creative control. Like that's the
Sure.
Eagles, right? The Eagles,
Mhm.
it's a super band. Yeah, they all argue about how to play guitar and how to do drums because they all know all the instruments, and they're always like, "You're not doing it the way I would do it," right? Which that
Mhm.
happens in computers all the time too. As long as stop with the argument, like just get the work done, right? And Girard doesn't really account for that, right? And this is what I mean by taking slices can be dangerous because you can put everything in that frame. You can do that, but it's wrong, and it's hard to know when you've done it,
Yeah.
right? Because that gets tricky. But the idea that the one cannot stand for the many is correct, but the one can take responsibility for the many. And now you get back into the sacrificing up and
Mhm.
sacrificing down, which interestingly, Peugeot talked about that in one of the clips you sent. I think it was the last one. But he never defined sacrificing down. I was like, I'm all set with my notes. Like sacrificing down is, and he didn't
Uh-huh.
do it. And I'm like, dude, what are you doing? You
Uh-huh.
defined the other
Yeah.
sacrifices, not the down. I needed that
Uh-huh.
one. But I think
Huh.
that's it, right? Like
Yeah.
leaders sacrifice down,
Mhm. Yes.
right? So like a
Yeah.
leader will often take a hit for making a decision they didn't make, or for
Mhm.
something happening under their watch that they didn't know was happening, often that they told people not to do. I've seen this many times in corporate
Mhm.
consulting. They will be like, "Yep, it's my fault." And I'm like, "Dude, I was there. It's totally not your fault. What do you mean? Fire that jerk." Like he totally
Yeah.
went right against exactly what you said. Get rid of this guy because that's just the way I am, obviously.
Yeah.
I didn't say any of that out loud, but like I'm like, "What is going on?" And he'll just take the bullet.
Yeah.
And right, and that's a
I think that's
sacrifice.
right. Yeah. That's like the baseball coach at the press conference at the end when it was clearly a mistake by the player taking taking the
Yeah.
hit or, resolving that in conflict in private, that conflict between the coach and the player in private, and not calling that person out, not scapegoating that
Right.
person. Like, the reason why we lost is because of that guy. No, it's me. That, I'm the one going to take that. Yeah.
Right.
I think you're right. That's sacrificing down. Yeah.
Right. And
And,
so
and
Girard,
see,
right. Right. In that the one can't stand for the many, but the one can take responsibility for the many.
mhm.
And that restores hierarchy.
I think a proper sacrifice, now I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but what you'll notice is that when you sacrifice in the proper way, it always comes back. So when you sacrifice up,
Mhm.
it comes back to you. Peugeot's example of a sacrifice up would be, for example, paying taxes. So in a
Right.
proper system, you sacrifice up, and now you have a road to drive on. So
Yes.
the sacrifice actually comes back. That's in the sense of in the sacrificial system, the idea that you would sacrifice the animal, but then that becomes a meal, and so now you're eating the animal. So you did sacrifice it up, but or around the kitchen table, you're all coming together and you're doing a sacrifice up for the sake of the family, unity of the family, and now it comes back. So that's, maybe there is a distinction to be made there. Girard is trying to critique the wrong way that sacrifices work, the wrong type of a sacrifice,
Right.
where and not really aware of when a sacrifice is doing some good.
Right.
The way the necessary the necessity for sacrifice in order for there to be anything, in
Yes.
order for there to be a group of anything, a baseball team, a family, a country, there has to be sacrifices up and sacrifices down. So really, it seems to me that the task is to figure out what is the proper sacrifice, not no sacrifice at all. We got to get rid of these sacrifices.
Right. Exactly. And I'd say that's the flat world thinking from Girard again. And I'd say the reason why people fall into it is because when you're trying to understand the world, you can't. So you flatten it. And that's kind of fair, but also you flatten the world. And what are you leaving out? Because you're leaving out most of it. Always, right? I mean, this is the map for the territory problem, right? You've created a map that's a flat representation, right? It could, a map. There are maps that represent the landscape in different ways, right? And they can represent the height and things like that just fine, right? But it's still flat. Like it's still a flat map, right? And so it's still missing something, probably lots of things. And the more stuff you put on the map, the more confused you get, the more choices so there's no way out of this in some sense. You just have to be careful that that's not sort of what you're doing. And the idea that Girard has that desires are mediated, I thought was just excellent, right? They're mediated by a model or probably models, right? And this is where I think a big opportunity was lost. Like Girard could have gone into, well, your model can tell you negative things or positive things, right? And if it tells you negative things, you're going to have conflict. If it tells you positive things, you're going to have a cooperation, right? Be able to build something bigger than you. And
Right.
that I think
Yeah.
that's a really important sort of point of nuance, right?
Yeah. Like the role model, you know, um, you could say that a bad role model will cause desires to arise in you that put you in conflict. you know
Right,
whereas a
right,
good role model will kind of like reorient your desires, like I was saying, like the best player on the team. If you have a role model as the best player on the team, then all of those little desires that would be causing conflict and rivalry between all the other team, all of a sudden those things are dissolved away. They kind of everything gets aligned properly. And this is, I really think that the word for that is worship. you know
yeah,
it's where you're putting all of your attention on the right thing and desiring the right thing. And this
yeah,
is Dante. This is Dante's Divine Comedy. This
yeah.
is He learns how to desire the right thing and then move towards the right thing. you know
Mm,
and I think, in a way, I just don't think Girard is aware of that process.
no,
that there is a way of, and this is why it's so pessimistic. He winds up in such a pessimistic place, I think.
Yeah, that's the flat world. Like if you're winding up in pessimism, you're in a flat world. It's easy. Like if you're angry and resentful, it's because you're in a flat world. Like you have a bad model of the world. The world is a very hopeful, interesting place. I mean, I'm especially blessed. I've got this pond, right? And this year, for some reason, the dragonflies are out in force, and so I got to walk out my door, and there are dragonflies everywhere, flying all over the place, and they're all colorful and stuff in South Carolina. And I was just enchanted. Like I'm just living in an enchanted world all the time. All I have to do is walk outside. So it's fantastic, right? So
Hmm.
when you flatten the world, though, you don't see the dragonflies, or you've got bugs. Right? You reduce them to bugs. And dragonflies are gorgeous, and they're also amazing. Look up dragonflies on YouTube. Like they're quite unique. It's amazing. They're little dinosaurs too, which is cool. Um,
Mm.
but they do things other flying insects can't do, any of them, right? And so that's amazing, right? Or you can just think of them as like in the way, or cluttering the view, or whatever. There's a dozen ways to think about them. Also, they eat mosquitoes, so I highly recommend dragonflies. If you don't want mosquitoes, get dragonflies. That's how you. But having that affect of no, my yard's a mess. It's unkempt. Like this is not a manicured place, my friend, at all. It's like, and I like it. Like I want it that way. And we've been cleaning it up a little bit and planting flowers and
Mhm.
stuff. But like, nah, I don't want a lawn to mow, and I don't believe in any of that anyway. So I'm happy the way it is. It's very wild, right? But it's also very enchanted for me.
Mhm.
And I'm always like, I had to cut trees down. That just breaks my heart. I love trees, but these trees had to go. One of them was dead. You know,
Mm.
that sacrificing of the trees for the better yard, because now I have more sunshine and you can see the pond better, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not all downside, the fact that I cut down trees, right? It's just a hard
Mhm.
decision. And Girard doesn't deal with that. He doesn't deal with decisions and judgment at all. Right. Again, because he flattens the world to all victims are scapegoats, all victims are innocent. And it's just we don't live in that. We'll never live in that world. Right. But the idea that desire is mediated by a model is important, because it can tell you whether or not your model is good or bad. Are you getting good results out of your model or not? Because if you're not getting contentedness out of your model, you have a bad model of the world. The world is here for you because it was created for you, and it should allow you to be contented. And if you're not contented, that's you. That's not the world. That's you. That I think is a much better message, right? Because you're not making a sacrifice, right? You're not scapegoating something in your life that you want to get contentedness, right? Because you're holding on to something, in an egoic way. Um, and a lot of that comes from a lot of these ideas around modern equal societies, which is a term he used. And I was like, what a great way to frame things. That's a fantastic frame. Um, and equality doctrines, as I said before, they're always a problem. Like equality is the worst thing that you can think of, like unless it's applied to abstractions, right? Equal treatment, equal opportunity, that's fine. Equal people, no. No, that's where you get into equal dragonflies. No, you don't want equal dragonflies. Believe me, you want different colored dragonflies. It's very pretty, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and we're not equal. We're not equal to ourselves, right? Like I'm hopefully better in some ways than I was yesterday. I'm also older, so I'm worse in some ways than I was yesterday, right? But like I'm not equal to what I was yesterday,
Yeah.
right? And there's no problem. That's not a problem. That's a solution, right? It affords opportunity and miracles and potential and all those other things. Um, and so you can re-enchant Girard's work with just a few sort of simple concepts. I mean, another point he makes is that students must mimic their teachers and also their parents. Like you have to, right? And that's good to know, right? It matters who's teaching your kids. It matters a lot who you let be a teacher. And if your criteria is pass this test, right, which is effectively what degree is, maybe that's a bad criteria, right? Maybe a
Mhm.
better criteria is cares about children, right? That might be a much better criteria, or or cares about the ideal of education. That's a better criteria, right? Because I had especially English teachers. English teachers for some reason always tend to be crazy, and unlike all the other teachers, I don't know why. But I had English teachers would just they'd stop the class, say close your book in the middle for apparently no reason. Maybe they were crazy. I don't know. Maybe they knew exactly what they were doing. I have no idea. I was a kid. I can't judge them. I can't. I wasn't there in the way I'm there now. And even in that, who knows? Right? I don't know. Maybe they're right. Um,
Mm.
they would they would just go off on a story. Like we're in the middle of learning English grammar, dude. What are you doing? Right? Like I had an English teacher in Catholic uh, school where he had us read Call of the Wild. Jack London is, if you don't think Jack London is one of the best authors ever, then you've got
Yeah.
brain damage or something, as far as I'm concerned. He's awesome. So we're reading like I think it's like, I forget how much of the book we're reading, but it's basically the section where Buck gets captured, right, and starts to get trained. So we're we're reading that section, right? And then you come in the next day with your paragraph on that section. And we come in and he's wearing a freaking red sweater, just like in the book, of the guy who was punishing the dog. Right now,
Mhm.
first of all, I love dogs. Punishing dogs to me is a very yes, you punish dogs, sure. Yes, you punish dogs physically sometimes, sure. Hit dogs with stick? I'm gonna hit you with a stick. Like, no, no, you do not do that. Maybe in extreme circumstances, but like the circumstances of the book were not extreme. Poor Buck had a
Yeah.
nice life, and he's being taken away from that, right? And so, like, I mean, we all noticed right away that he was wearing a red sweater. It's Mr. O'Rourke. He was wearing a red sweater, and we're all like, "Oh, yeah, what does this mean?" Like, I don't. How beneficial was that to me? I don't know. I'm sure it was. I'm sure that was the right thing for him to do. I'm
Mhm.
positive of it. I don't know how. I don't know how consciously. I mean, he knew he was wearing a red sweater, and we had read the red sweater section. There's no
Yeah.
he knew, right? He let us know that he knew, right? And
Yeah.
he chuckled about it too, right? Because we were kids, we couldn't not, we did not confront the teacher at that age. So someone did. We're also wise asses because we were in a small, tiny private Catholic school. Um, I don't know, what that does, but like it's important that he did that, and it's important that he was teaching in that way, and that he exemplified that, right? For whatever reason, right? Because at some point, we could get into lit crit on Call of the
Mhm.
Wild. That's not a problem for me. I can do it on the top of my head. I know the book pretty well. You could say that Bach is equivalent to the guy in the cave in Plato's cave, right? And that he's trapped and he has no choice, and the world just comes at him, and he has to conform to the world. Sure, absolutely. Also, that's true, and you're never getting around that ever, no matter what you do. So stop trying, all right, and instead
Mhm.
sacrifice, give up, so that you can cooperate with people, because that's just a better way to go. It's a better thing to do, right? And recognizing that your students are going to be, or that your children are going to be subject as students to teachers is important. And look, maybe you do homeschooling. I have relatives that did homeschooling. I know lots of people that do homeschooling for that reason.
Yeah.
Whatever. That's fine. But you probably don't need to. I know other people who've decided, oh, I don't need to actually because my community is pretty good and the teachers are good, and so it's not a problem, right? And those are hard decisions, right? Those are the hardest decisions you're ever going to make in your life, probably. Right? If you have kids, do you send them to school or not? Because it's a dangerous thing, right? But Girard just comes right out and says that the mimicry is going to happen,
Yeah.
and you're not in control of it in that case, right? And that's
Yeah.
another point is you're not in control of the mimicry all the time.
Yeah. Well, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, the what you know, you can see it with kids. I mean, the more you're around kids, you know, like my nieces and nephews, for example, or you can just see, you know, they're looking for something to lock onto. They're looking for something to mimic, you know,
Yeah.
so they're going to find something. And so if you don't put something in front of them that is exemplary, that they should
Right.
go towards, they're going to find something else. And if you're not aware of that, you know,
Yeah.
you're going to want, you know, I had a friend a while back who sent their kid to an art school, and there was this anarchist teacher at this art school, and it was just hit right at the right time. It was right at the right moment when this kid wanted to find an example beyond his own dad, was looking for something, was frustrated with this, was frustrated with that. It all just conspired together where he just locked on to this anarchist teacher at Orange County School of the Arts or whatever, you know. And I just remember the dad going, "Oh, like I just can't believe that happened," you know. I and he knew what the if this kid never would have met that anarchist teacher, his life would have went so different,
Right.
and it went very negative very fast. And so, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like, you know, and this is why I think why when I go to Europe and I see the architecture there, and I
Mhm.
look at the highest thing in the town, and I see this gorgeous cathedral, I understand why that's there. It's not a waste. Like a lot of
Right.
people think, well, why would you waste all of that, you know, effort and stuff on that beautiful thing, you know, when you could be doing something more useful or more, you know, whatever, you know, it's useless. You know, this beautiful thing in the middle of the town is the modern way of thinking. That's why we don't build stuff like
Right.
that. We just build a glass
Right.
tower. You know, it's like just functional. That's all we need it to be. Well, that's an ignoring a very important part of how we are moved and inspired to go
Right.
in a certain direction in life. You know, we need
Right.
those things, you know. So that's something in the modern world that we've lost. It would in this equal the equality thing, it has also something to do with the practical, like the function, like just
Yep.
we just need that building to have fluorescent lights and a carpet and a place to get in and out, and that's all we need. We don't need. And then everyone's like, how come I'm so depressed in my job, in my
Right.
cubicle with this fluorescent lights and everything?
Right.
Maybe it's because there's nothing to look at to move you
Right.
towards the good, you know,
Right. Right.
something like that.
Right, right. Well, and yeah, and sort of Girard goes into this. I mean, the other thing he says is no society without religion. Well, what is religion? Religion is the practice of the things that are the highest, right?
Mm.
To some extent. I mean, that's a crude, simple, overly simplified single example of what a definition of religion might look like. Um, and he says medieval society had elements of Christianity which we've lost. Like this is why, like I see why everybody loves him. That's Peugeot all day long, right? Like Peugeot
Mhm.
explicitly talks about that, and he says we're living in a Christianity which we fail to recognize. That's Tom Holland's Dominion.
Yeah.
All right, we're sucking on the bones, and then he does what I think is even more interesting to some extent is he, like I said, he quotes de Tocqueville, and he starts talking about democracy destroys the king, right? And then you think that you have an easy route to the things that the king had, right? You think there's an easy route. But what happens is the obstacles have changed and multiplied. So now they're not as great, but there's more of them, right? Which is really, there's more competition. And if you kind of look around today, that's what you'll see, right? And
Mhm.
in that instance, he's talking about internal and external mediation, basically, of things. But
Mhm.
ultimately, yeah, when you destroy the hierarchy, when you flatten the world, you get competition with a lot more people for a lot fewer things, right? Because they spread out. It's the flood. It's definitely
Yeah.
the flood, right? And yeah, we don't recognize any of that. Um, but all of those are like really really good points that he makes without expanding on anything. And that to me is where the problem is that there's so many easy ways to expand the worldview, right, and fix some of this stuff, because ultimately I think mimicry is, and to some extent exemplification, which I would put as part of mimicry, right? Like the thing you're mimicking is your exemplar. That is wrapped up in participatory knowledge, which is what John Vervaeke talks about. Like that is wrapped up in, why are you acting certain things out? This is the non-propositional side of the world. And that
Yeah.
doesn't get enough attention at all. Right.
Hmm.
That's actually where the
Yeah.
problem is we're thinky talky, right? And only thinky talky and not doey. Right. And that's why, like, my specialty is practices, right? That's what
Mhm.
Manuel and I worked on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server for years, right? And then it's all of our work is focused around practices. And all of the stuff we talk about comes from our experience of practices, all of it. It didn't start out as like a treaty on another text or any of that. It started out as an exploration of, well, what did Vervaeke's meditation series and Cultivating Wisdom series do for us as participants, right? How do we understand our participation in that, right? And this is where Girard falls down, right? Because again, he's lit critic, right? So he's putting everything into literature and then criticizing it, which, whatever. I mean, that's what he does. That's how he started. Like, that's what he is. You can't fault him too much for that. Even though, like I said, I think lit crit, the idea is invalid, like just flat out. I mean, maybe you could criticize a romance novel because, like, who cares? They read 1,000 of them a day, but you're not going to criticize Shakespeare. That's not valid. And this is where it kind of gets into trouble. So look, Justin, I know you have to go at some point in the near future. Here's
Yes.
my proposal. My proposal is, I think we actually did a pretty good job of covering, we'll say most of the stuff I wanted to cover. There's other material in here that I could cover, but actually I don't want to cover it because I want to use it in other videos to point out bad things and patterns that you can avoid, right? It's all about navigating patterns. But why don't we set up another time to talk about, I have a section called corrections and alternatives,
Okay.
and talk
Yeah, yeah.
about how to improve on the Girardian models and talk more about how they integrate with the Peterson sphere stuff. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, and also we could try to articulate what Peugeot's, because he says in that one video I send you, he goes, "Here's my theory of the scapegoat, and this is going to be better." And he goes, "I don't mean to be bragging, but this is going to be better than Girard's theory of the scapegoat." You know, so I think it's worth trying to tease out what that is, um, because yeah, I think you're right. You know, it's important to go through to let's say, um, do what Girard did was reintroduce certain categories into the discourse that people had
Yeah.
thrown out with modernism and postmodernism, such as, religion for one, the scapegoat for another, sacrifice, these things that people just didn't even want to consider thinking about.
Mimicry,
And he did a
desire.
good yeah, exactly. And that service is, that's a good thing that we can now bring that out to talk about those things. But I think you're right in the sense of we need to find a better way forward than his super pessimistic conclusion, which is the gospel brings the apocalypse and we're all going to just blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons because now we don't have a scapegoat mechanism to, you know. So so yeah, I think that would be fruitful. And I can't wait to hear what people think of our rendition of it, if they
Yeah.
if they think we're missing something, or if we're being fair to him. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Comment. We're probably gonna go ahead and schedule the talk anyway, but like, tell us if you
Yeah.
want the talk and what you want in it, and because it's quite possible that I'll post this before we do the talk, and we'd love feedback. So yeah, comment on the video. Let us know what you found that was useful in this, and what was not, because I like negative feedback. Justin's like, no, I only hear good stuff. Uh, so, so yeah, let us know. Yeah, let's schedule another conversation for whenever we can manage it offline here, and hopefully this sort of forwards this discussion within the Peterson sphere on this particular set of topics, because I think this is where all the meat is. Honestly, I think participatory knowledge, even though I disagree with the term knowledge in this instance, talking about that is important. Like, really, like, I think that's way more important than any of the discussions going on. and sacrifice, I think, is way more important than any of the other discussions going on. So I think focusing on that is actually a really, really good idea. The only other thing to focus on is poetry and poetics, which I think Ted did a good job with in the Convivium event. So hopefully people have engaged with those videos. I'll probably link them here because they're such excellent videos. Those are sort of the three areas I think that are most important to help to. I understand we're not re-enchanting the world, right? But we're re-enchanting the world for people. And I think those are the three areas that we need to go in. So next time, you guys will give us feedback. We'll try to incorporate that. Hopefully that'll be in before we do our talk. But if not, then c'est la vie. And we'll try to get to the bottom of this and move it forward. Any other parting thoughts there, Justin?
No, I think you said it all. That's great.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And we will be talking again soon.